December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack that dragged the United States into World War II was swift and brutal. But as the American Navy reeled from the aerial devastation, a quieter, more insidious strategic failure was already built into the very weapons they intended to use for revenge: the Mark 14 torpedo. This torpedo, the centerpiece of the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific, was the most complex and expensive piece of hardware issued to the silent service. Each Mark 14 cost approximately $10,000 in wartime currency, the equivalent of a small naval vessel in the interwar years, and was entrusted to sink the critical Japanese troop transports and warships that sustained the empire. The Navy leadership, rooted in decades of secrecy and bureaucratic pride, believed the Mark 14 was the perfect weapon, a technological masterpiece superior to anything the Japanese possessed. The reality was a continuous, catastrophic failure. As the submarines of the Pacific Fleet began their patrols in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, their captains began reporting shocking, almost unbelievable results. Target after target, Japanese cruisers, tankers, and cargo ships were being missed despite being hit squarely. Torpedoes that struck their targets often failed to explode. Those that did explode were often running too deep, passing harmlessly beneath the enemy hull. Captain after captain, facing immense danger, reported the same grim sequence: fire, run true, hit target, no explosion. The reports flowed back to the Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, in Washington, D.C., the secretive agency responsible for designing and testing the weapon. But the BUORD was deeply entrenched in the masterpiece philosophy. Their engineers believed their weapon was perfect, therefore the failure must be human. They concluded that the submarine captains, firing from extreme angles and under the stress of combat, were either aiming poorly or exaggerating the hits. The failure, they insisted, was one of marksmanship, not engineering. This bureaucratic arrogance created a fatal, crippling rift. The submarine captains, the men who faced death daily, knew their reports were accurate. They were sinking million-dollar torpedoes and losing the opportunity to sink billion-dollar Japanese convoys. Yet their reports were dismissed, sometimes with implied accusations of cowardice or incompetence. The BUORD, relying on controlled pre-war testing data gathered on pristine ranges off Rhode Island, simply refused to believe that their weapon, the technological pride of the Navy, could possess a fundamental, catastrophic flaw. The true cost of this disbelief was measured not in dollars, but in lost time and Japanese lives spared. For the entire first year of the war, the U.S. submarine fleet was effectively fighting with blunt weapons, allowing hundreds of thousands of tons of Japanese war material to reach the front lines uncontested. The Japanese, unaware of their incredible stroke of luck, continued to use slow, predictable shipping routes that should have been graveyards. The problem was not the enemy. The problem was the invisible, catastrophic failure built into a seemingly insignificant piece of mechanical engineering deep inside the torpedo's nose. The Mark 14 torpedo was designed with three complex, interdependent subsystems, each essential for delivering the explosive payload. The weapon was a triumph of complex engineering and a disaster of operational reliability. The first subsystem was the depth-keeping mechanism. This was governed by a hydrostatic valve designed to maintain the torpedo at a precise, preset depth. The U.S. Navy preferred deep-running torpedoes to avoid surface screens and utilized the destructive power of a hit under the keel of a ship, known as a magnetic influence detonation. The depth was designed to be accurate within 6 inches. Submarine captains quickly discovered that the torpedoes were consistently running 10 to 11 feet deeper than set. A torpedo set for 10 feet was passing harmlessly at 21 feet. This flaw alone caused hundreds of misses against shallow draft ships and tankers in the first months of the war. The second and most devastating subsystem was the detonation mechanism. The Mark 14 employed a two-pronged approach. The primary trigger was the magnetic influence exploder, a sensitive magnetic sensor designed to detonate the torpedo under the target's keel, breaking the ship's back with a shock wave and ensuring a kill. The secondary trigger was the contact exploder, designed to detonate the warhead only upon direct impact with the ship's hull, the mechanical backup. When the magnetic exploder proved unstable, often detonating prematurely, missing the target, or running erratically, the captains reverted to the contact exploder, aiming for a direct hit. Here they encountered the true core disaster. The contact exploder failed almost every time. Reports described torpedoes hitting targets at a perfect 90-degree angle, only to become lodged in the ship's hull like a massive metal javelin, or ricocheting off the side, failing to explode, and continuing their run harmlessly out to sea. These non-detonations were the ultimate psychological blow. The captains knew they had done their job perfectly, yet the weapon betrayed them. The cause of both major flaws was rooted in the Buord's insistence on a closed testing environment. The torpedoes had been tested only in warm, low-salinity waters near the east coast of the U.S. They were never tested with a full warhead, as live torpedoes were too expensive and valuable to risk. Instead, they used a substitute charge, a practice that concealed the flaws. The Buord refused to believe that the Pacific's colder, higher salinity waters could affect the sensitive magnetic exploder, the depth flaw. More critically, the substitute charge used in peacetime testing was too light. It did not replicate the massive inertia and impact shock generated by the full 648-pound warhead when striking a steel hull. This lack of realistic testing meant a simple, critical mechanical weakness in the contact exploder went undetected for over a decade. The Navy was fighting a modern war with a weapon designed and tested under peacetime illusions. The crisis of the torpedo war was exacerbated by an entrenched bureaucratic blockade at the Bureau of Ordnance. Buord. Submarine commanders, risking court-martial, resorted to desperate measures to prove the weapon was defective. They photographed targets hit by duds and even retrieved dud torpedoes that had become lodged in beaches. One captain, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, achieved a direct, irrefutable hit on a Japanese destroyer, only for the torpedo to fail. He later stated that losing the kill was less painful than the psychological certainty that the weapon, his primary means of offense, was useless. The captains, the men who had the data, were ignored. The Buord, protected by decades of inter-service secrecy and institutional pride, considered their mathematical models and theoretical testing superior to actual combat reports. The official response from Washington, D.C. was cynical and uniform. The torpedoes are perfect. Check your firing procedure. This refusal to acknowledge the flaw had a crushing strategic cost. By the end of 1942, the U.S. submarine force had squandered almost 2,000 torpedoes, a staggering investment of resources and, more importantly, a catastrophic loss of opportunity. The Japanese war machine was allowed to operate largely unhindered, shipping fuel, rubber, and troops that should have been at the bottom of the Pacific. The technical flaw at the heart of the contact exploder was found to be a tiny but critically important firing pin lock, a mechanism intended to prevent the warhead from detonating prematurely during launch or rough handling. This lock was designed to shear off upon impact, allowing the main firing pin to strike the detonator. However, due to the cheap, insufficiently tested metal alloy used and the massive deceleration shock of the full warhead, the firing pin lock was too strong. Instead of shearing cleanly upon impact, the lock would buckle or jam, preventing the main firing pin from completing its travel. The torpedo would hit the enemy hull, the warhead would fail, and the entire $10,000 weapon would be rendered inert. The key to ending the war in the Pacific was paralyzed by a single piece of insufficiently tested metal costing a few dollars. This stalemate persisted because the Navy's rigid chain of command refused to allow the Buord's authority to be challenged by the operational fleet. The solution could only come from outside the traditional command structure, requiring a hero brave enough to bypass the bureaucracy and prove the Navy's technological masterpiece was, in fact, a strategic liability. The breakthrough came from a single, isolated command, far from the self-congratulatory atmosphere of Washington, D.C. In early 1943, frustrated by the continuous stream of dud reports, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the submarine force, Pacific Fleet, COMSOPAC, decided to bypass the Buord entirely. He ordered his own men to solve the problem that the Navy's top engineers insisted did not exist. Lockwood gave the task to Lieutenant Commander Swede Mommsen and a small, dedicated team of engineers and mechanics at the Pearl Harbor submarine base. Mommsen's team was not restricted by the political pride of the Buord. They were motivated by the grim necessity of war and the direct pleas of the submarine crews. They knew that solving the torpedo crisis would save thousands of American lives. The challenge lay in replicating the massive, sudden shock of a torpedo hitting a steel hull, a test the Buord had never performed with a live warhead. Mommsen's solution was brilliantly simple and characteristically pragmatic. They took the costly, complex torpedo, removed the main warhead, and replaced it with a dummy head containing recording equipment and lights. They then fired the torpedoes into the cliffs of a remote island or into massive captured steel plates mounted deep in the ocean. The goal was simple: watch the results. The findings were immediate and damning. The test proved two things the Buord had denied for years. First, the torpedoes did, in fact, run 10 to 11 feet too deep due to an unforeseen flaw in the hydrostatic mechanism, exacerbated by the Pacific's water conditions. Second, and more catastrophically, the contact exploder mechanism failed repeatedly upon direct impact. The complex firing pin lock, instead of cleanly shearing, buckled and jammed, just as the submarine captains had repeatedly reported. Mommsen's team had physically and visually confirmed the failure. The flaw was not human, it was a simple, correctable engineering defect. The elegant, complex design, created in peacetime, was unable to handle the brutal reality of wartime physics. The solution to the contact exploder flaw was achieved by Lieutenant Commander E.A. Dennis, an ordnance engineer under Mommsen. He identified the weak point, the firing pin lock and its insufficient shear pin. He designed a simple replacement part, a stronger, heavier firing pin lock made of a different, more reliable alloy, paired with a simple steel reinforcing ring to stabilize the assembly upon impact. This replacement piece was not a marvel of science. It cost only a few dollars, an estimated $5 to $10 per unit. Yet this simple component, developed in a wartime machine shop rather than a bureaucratic laboratory, was the key to unlocking the full potential of the Pacific Fleet. Lockwood now had the unassailable data. He confronted the Buord with the evidence, including film footage of the dud hits. Faced with irrefutable proof in the strategic urgency of the war, the Buord was finally forced to admit decades of error and authorize the fix. The simple, inexpensive parts were immediately mass-produced and flown out to every submarine tender in the Pacific. The age of the dud torpedo was finally over. The strategic failure of the Mark 14 torpedo, the $5 flaw in the $10,000 weapon, exacted a crushing and often uncalculated toll on the American war effort. A cost rooted entirely in bureaucratic pride and the initial refusal to accept field reports. The story of the dud torpedo is not just a story of engineering failure. It is a stark lesson in how institutional arrogance can directly bleed into battlefield losses. The most profound impact was measured in time. For the entire first year of the war, the critical period when the Japanese Empire was expanding rapidly and consolidating its gains, the U.S. submarine fleet was operating at an effectiveness rate far below its capability. The failure of the torpedoes meant that the Japanese maritime supply lines, shipping oil from Indonesia, rubber from Malaysia, and troops to key defensive islands, remained largely intact and unmolested. Experts later estimated that if the torpedoes had functioned correctly from the start, the Pacific War could have been shortened by 6 months to a year. That is the human and material cost of a single flawed piece of mechanism. The financial cost was staggering. The U.S. Navy wasted over 2,000 Mark 14 torpedoes in the first year alone, a loss of resources that, in today's currency, amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars. But the true monetary loss was measured by the tonnage that escaped. Every Japanese tanker or troop ship that was merely damaged or missed entirely by a dud torpedo continued to fuel the imperial war machine. The failure of the contact exploder guaranteed that the Japanese were fighting the Americans with resources that should have been on the seabed. The failure also created a crisis of morale and confidence. The submarine service, the silent service, operates on absolute trust in its equipment and absolute discipline. When highly decorated captains reported perfect hits and saw only failure, it eroded their trust in the Navy's engineering, breeding a corrosive doubt that was as dangerous as any depth charge. For months, submarine commanders were forced to develop their own dangerous, unauthorized field fixes, rigging the torpedoes to run shallower, which increased the risk of the torpedo being seen or broaching the surface, or modifying the exploders, risking catastrophic early detonation just to ensure a potential hit. The moment Admiral Lockwood and his men implemented the simple, redesigned firing pin lock and reinforcing ring, the strategic situation transformed almost overnight. The fix was cheap, easy to install in the field, and immediately effective. The subsequent patrol reports told the story. The kill rate skyrocketed. The average patrol now resulted in multiple confirmed sinkings, turning the Japanese logistics system from a steady stream into a devastating trickle. The $5 tool had not merely fixed a weapon, it had redeemed the confidence of an entire branch of the U.S. Navy, allowing them to finally begin the systematic destruction of the Japanese supply lines, the war the Navy was designed to fight. The success of the $5 fix instantly translated into a devastating reversal of fortune for the U.S. Navy. The fleet's kill rate, the percentage of torpedoes fired that resulted in a sinking, skyrocketed, proving the captains had been right all along. This was the moment of redemption for the silent service, a moment where bureaucratic arrogance was replaced by battlefield effectiveness. The effect was not just the sinking of individual ships, it was the systematic disruption of the Japanese Empire's economic lifeline. The Japanese war effort was fundamentally reliant on the steady supply of raw materials, particularly oil and rubber, from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia back to the home islands. The U.S. submarine fleet was the only force capable of severing this economic artery. When the Mark 14 finally worked, the trickle of sinkings turned into a continuous, catastrophic torrent. The captains, now operating with absolute trust in their weapons, became emboldened. The psychological chains of doubt were broken. They could now employ tactics that were previously too risky, knowing that a perfect hit would finally result in a definitive kill. This confidence amplified the effectiveness of the fleet far beyond the simple mechanical fix. The numbers from the subsequent patrols told the final story of the transformation. Before the fix, the average U.S. submarine patrol was a costly, frustrating exercise, often yielding 0 confirmed kills despite numerous shots fired. After the fix, reports began flooding Admiral Lockwood's office, detailing multiple sinkings per patrol. The sheer tonnage of Japanese shipping rose exponentially, making the losses irrecoverable for the resource-strapped Imperial Navy. The strategic consequence was profound. The U.S. submarine campaign ultimately accounted for the sinking of over 50% of all Japanese merchant shipping, a loss that choked the Japanese war economy, starved its factories of raw materials, and restricted the movement of troops. This systemic starvation of the Japanese war machine was directly attributable to the decision to listen to the men in the field and replace a cheap, faulty component with an equally cheap but reliable piece of engineering. The $5 reinforcing ring had saved the American war effort years of conflict and prevented the loss of countless lives. It proved that in the chaotic, high-stakes environment of global conflict, simplicity and reliability, even in the smallest component, are worth infinitely more than a complex, over-engineered design built on the foundation of institutional pride. The story of the Dud torpedo ultimately resolves not as a tale of naval heroism, but as a stark, unforgiving verdict on the dangers of bureaucratic detachment from reality. The fundamental flaw in the Mark 14 torpedo was not a deep scientific mystery. It was a simple, correctable mechanical failure caused by an initial design team that substituted theoretical models for real-world testing. The cost of this error, the years lost, the ships spared, the lives wasted, was the highest price paid for institutional pride in the entire Pacific War. The contrast with the eventual fix is absolute. The solution did not come from the thousands of engineers and millions of dollars of infrastructure held by the Bureau of Ordnance. It came from a few dedicated men, led by Admiral Lockwood and Commander Momsen, who embraced pragmatism over precedent and used simple, field-expedient methods to achieve a clear, undeniable truth. The fix itself, a simple reinforced firing pin lock costing mere dollars, was a powerful testament to the value of simplistic, reliable component design in a system of high complexity. The legacy of the Mark 14 torpedo is now taught as a critical lesson in both military and engineering circles. First, the danger of closed-loop testing. The Bureau of Ordnance failed because it only tested the torpedoes in ideal, isolated peacetime conditions, refusing to subject them to the high salinity, cold temperatures, and extreme impact forces of real combat. This isolation ensured that the weapon remained perfect on paper, while it was fatally flawed in practice. Second, the cost of ignoring field data. The officers on the front lines risking their lives provided the only truthful data available. The Buord's refusal to accept this data in favor of its own theoretical models created a strategic crisis that nearly cost the entire submarine war. The lesson is that the truth of the battlefield must always supersede the pride of the drawing room. The final victory of the U.S. submarine fleet, which ultimately choked the Japanese economy, was built upon the reliability purchased by a $5 part. The simple, reinforced mechanism redeemed the entire inventory of Mark 14 torpedoes and delivered the overwhelming strategic force the Navy needed. The ultimate lesson of the $5 fix is this. In modern warfare, the greatest liability is not an enemy with superior technology. It is a complex, over-engineered system crippled by a single, cheap, and easily fixable failure of philosophy. Reliability, even when achieved through the most mundane and inexpensive component, is the ultimate strategic weapon.